The fire in the grate at 221B Baker Street had settled into that particular stage of contentment, known only to coals that have burned through their first eagerness and found their rhythm, a steady glow that asked nothing, gave warmth freely, and occasionally sighed a small spark upward like a satisfied thought. The room itself seemed to breathe with it, the walls holding the amber light close, the Persian slipper hanging from the mantelpiece casting a shadow that swayed almost imperceptibly, and the stack of newspapers beside Watson's chair rustling faintly as the heat rose and fell. Outside, a December rain tapped at the windows with the patience of someone who knew they would not be invited in, but was content to keep company from the other side of the glass. Watson sat in his armchair, his evening paper spread across his lap. Though his eyes had drifted from the words some minutes ago to watch the rain trace silver paths down the window pane, there was a particular comfort in evenings like this, the kind that wrapped around a man like a well-worn coat, familiar in every seam and weight. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps had passed in the hallway below some time ago, her tread soft and certain, followed by the small percussion of her closing the door to her own rooms. The day had been put to rest in the way that only London in winter knew how, tucked in with fog and lamplight, chimney smoke, and the distant echo of hooves on wet cobblestones. Holmes stood near the window, his violin tucked beneath his chin, though he had not yet drawn the bow across the strings. Instead, he held the instrument as one might hold a conversation partner whose turn it was to speak, waiting with that particular stillness he possessed, not the absence of movement, but the presence of attention so complete it required no motion at all. The scent of his tobacco lingered in the room, mingling with the older smells of leather bindings, lamp oil, and the faint medicinal sharpness of the chemicals that lived in their bottles on the shelves, patient as monks. "The rain will turn to sleet by morning," Holmes said quietly, more to the window than to Watson, his breath fogging the glass in a small, temporary cloud. The temperature is dropping. You can hear it in the way the rain falls, less splash, more click. Ice forming at the edges of things. Watson smiled into his paper. "I shall take your word for it, Holmes. My ears are better suited to heartbeats than weather patterns." "And yet, both follow rhythms," Holmes replied, finally drawing the bow across the strings in a long, low note that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the instrument itself, from the room, perhaps, or the evening, or the particular quality of stillness that winter brought to Baker Street. The note held, wavered, and released, leaving a silence that felt fuller than the sound had been. It was into this silence that the interruption came, not loudly, but with the kind of precision that makes a small sound impossible to ignore. A knock at the door below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's voice, muffled but clear enough. Measured words to someone on the threshold, then the creak of the door opening wider. Footsteps on the stairs, but only one set, Mrs. Hudson's, ascending alone. Holmes lowered his violin, his head tilting in that way that always reminded Watson of a foxhound catching a scent. "A telegram," he said, "delivered by hand at this hour. Not urgent enough for the boy to wait, but unusual enough that Mrs. Hudson feels it requires immediate delivery rather than leaving it for morning." Watson had learned long ago not to ask how Holmes knew such things before they occurred. It was easier and more peaceful to simply wait for the world to confirm what Holmes had already observed in the angle of a stairs creak or the particular rhythm of their landlady's approach. The knock came soft but deliberate. "Mr. Holmes?" Mrs. Hudson's voice carried the same tone she used for anything that deviated from routine, not alarm, but acknowledgement that the evening's script had acquired an unscheduled line. "A telegram's come for you. The boy said it was sent from Ashford, and the sender paid extra for evening delivery." Holmes opened the door, and Mrs. Hudson stepped in with a small silver tray, the telegram resting at its centre like a white leaf that had drifted in from some foreign season. But it was not the paper that caught Watson's attention first. It was the seal. Instead of the usual red wax, this was a pale ice blue that seemed to glow faintly in the firelight, and the scent that rose from it was not wax at all, but something sharper, colder. Pine resin, certainly, but beneath that, something almost medicinal, like spirits of camphor, or perhaps wintergreen. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said, taking the tray with the careful attention he gave to anything that presented itself as ordinary, but insisted, through small details, that it was not. Mrs. Hudson nodded, cast a quick glance at the blue seal, her eyebrows rising just slightly, and withdrew, closing the door with the soft click of someone who knew when a case was beginning, and when her discretion was the most helpful thing she could offer. Holmes carried the tray to the table between the chairs, setting it down in the lamplight. He did not open the telegram immediately. Instead, he leaned over it, his face close enough that Watson could see his nostrils flare slightly, taking in the scent. Then Holmes straightened, reached for his lens, and examined the seal under magnification, his expression settling into that particular blend of interest and patience that Watson had come to recognize as the beginning of a hunt. "Blue sealing wax," Holmes murmured, "which is uncommon, but not unheard of, often used by certain county families in the home counties, particularly those with old Norman lineage who maintain heraldic traditions. But this particular shade and this scent—" He set down the lens and carefully broke the seal with his thumb, the wax cracking with a sound like thin ice on a puddle. The smell intensified for a moment. Pine, camphor, and something else. Something Watson's medical training nudged at, but could not quite name. Something cold and volatile. Holmes unfolded the telegram, his eyes moving across the words with the speed of a man reading a language he knew by heart. Then reading it again more slowly, looking not at what the words said, but at what they did not say. Finally, he passed it to Watson without comment. The message was brief, written in the clipped style that telegraphy demanded, but with a formality that suggested the sender had paid for extra words rather than compress their request into cryptic efficiency. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Baker Street, London. Stop your presence urgently requested at Greyfriars Estate. Ashford stop. Lord Carmichael found deceased in icehouse. Stop door bolted from exterior. Stop. No sign of tampering. Stop. Local constabulary baffled. Stop. Lady Carmichael requests your discretion and expertise. Stop. Will send carriage to Ashford Station upon your arrival. Stop. Reply if you require accommodation. Stop. Signed. Edmund Tovey, Steward, Greyfriars Estate. Watson read it twice, then looked up to find Holmes, standing once more at the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance that only he could see, not the rain, not the street below, but some configuration of facts arranging themselves into a pattern. An ice house, Watson said slowly, bolted from the outside. He frowned. But that would suggest, Holmes finished quietly, that Lord Carmichael locked himself into an ice house, and then, through some remarkable feat of dexterity or supernatural intervention, bolted the door from the outside after sealing himself within. Or he turned from the window, and there was a light in his eyes now, the particular gleam that came not from arrogance, but from genuine curiosity. The look of a man who had been given a puzzle that respected his intelligence enough to be genuinely puzzling. Or we are being invited to investigate something that wishes very much to appear impossible. Watson set the telegram down on the tray, his mind already moving through the medical implications. A body in an ice house in December. The cold would preserve it, somewhat, but you said the temperature's dropping. If he's been there more than a day. The telegram says, "Found deceased," Holmes interrupted gently, "not found frozen or found preserved. That distinction may prove important. And note the phrasing, no sign of tampering. Not the bolt was secure or the lock was intact, but no sign of tampering, which suggests that someone examined the mechanism expecting to find evidence of interference and found none. That is a very specific kind of bafflement, Watson." He crossed to his desk and began pulling down his railway guide, his movements now quick and certain. "The last train to Ashford leaves Charing Cross at 10:45. If we pack now, we can make it, though it will be a cold journey." He glanced at Watson, and his expression softened. "You need not come, of course. A country estate in winter is not conducive to comfort, and your leg—" "My leg," Watson said firmly, rising from his chair, "has survived worse than a train journey and a December investigation. Besides, someone needs to ensure you eat something more substantial than tobacco smoke and intellectual stimulation." He moved toward his room, then paused at the door. "Holmes, that scent on the seal. It wasn't just pine and camphor, was it?" Holmes looked up from the railway guide, and for a moment something passed across his face. Approval, perhaps, or simply the quiet pleasure of being understood. "No," he said. "There was juniper, and beneath that, something sharper. Ether, possibly, or chloroform, though too faint to be certain. Someone at Greyfriars has access to medical or laboratory supplies, and they chose to scent their sealing wax with it, whether as a message or simply as a peculiarity of habit." He smiled faintly. "Well, that is among the things we shall discover." Watson nodded and went to pack his bag, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. Warm clothes, medical kit, notebook, and the small flask of brandy that Mrs. Hudson always ensured was full before a winter journey. Behind him, he could hear Holmes moving about the sitting room, the soft thump of books being consulted, the scratch of pen on paper as a reply telegram was composed, and beneath it all the steady whisper of the rain at the windows, as though London itself was bidding them a soft farewell. By the time they descended the stairs 20 minutes later, carpet-bags in hand, the fire at 221B had been banked for their absence, and Mrs. Hudson stood in the hallway with 2 parcels wrapped in brown paper. "Cold ham and bread," she said, pressing them into Watson's hands, "and a thermos of tea. The trains never have enough heat this time of year, and you'll want something warm inside you before you go chasing locked doors and frozen corpses." "You are," Holmes said with genuine warmth, "a paragon of foresight and practicality, Mrs. Hudson." She sniffed, though her eyes were soft. "I'm a woman. Who knows what foolishness looks like when it puts on a coat and calls itself investigation? Mind you bring the thermos back, Dr. Watson. It belonged to my mother." They stepped out into the December night, and the rain met them with the cold kiss of a season turning its face toward true winter. A handsome cab waited at the curb, its horse stamping and blowing clouds of steam, the driver hunched into his greatcoat like a roosting bird. Holmes gave him the direction, Charing Cross, and quickly. And they climbed inside, the cab rocking gently as the horse leaned into the traces. As they rattled through the wet streets of London, past gas lamps that glowed like small moons in the fog, past shop windows darkened for the night, and the occasional lit window where someone else was still awake, still working, still holding back the winter dark with lamp oil and will. Watson unwrapped one of Mrs. Hudson's parcels and found not just ham and bread, but ginger biscuits as well, still warm. He offered one to Holmes, who took it with a nod of thanks, and for a time they sat in comfortable silence, the city passing like a dream outside the cab windows, and the prospect of Greyfriars Estate waiting ahead like a question that had not yet learned how to ask itself properly. The train station, when they reached it, was a cathedral of steam and iron, the great glass roof beaded with rain, the platforms busy with the particular energy of travellers who moved quickly, not from excitement, but from the desire to reach warmth sooner. They boarded the Ashford train with minutes to spare, finding an empty compartment near the rear, where the rocking of the carriages would be less pronounced. As the train pulled away from London, as the city's lights began to thin and scatter, giving way to the darkness of the countryside sleeping under December rain, Holmes settled into his corner seat and closed his eyes, not sleeping, Watson knew, but thinking, arranging the few facts they had into every possible configuration, discarding the impossible, cataloguing the improbable, and waiting with the patience of a man who knew that mysteries, like coals in a grate, revealed their true shape only after the first bright burning had subsided into something steadier, deeper, and more lasting. Watson pulled out his notebook and wrote a single line at the top of a fresh page: "The Ice House Murder." Then he, too, settled back and watched the night flow past the window like dark water, carrying them toward Greyfriars, toward a locked room and a cold death, toward a puzzle that had been sealed with blue wax and the scent of winter itself. The rhythm of the rails became a lullaby, and the warmth of the compartment, modest though it was, felt like the last piece of home they would carry with them into whatever waited in Ashford. Watson let his eyes close, just for a moment, and in that space between waking and sleep, he thought he could still smell the ginger biscuits, the coal, smoke from Baker Street, and beneath it all, faint as a ghost, that strange cold scent from the telegram seal. Pine, camphor, and something sharper, something that spoke of ice houses and bolted doors, and the particular silence that falls when winter tightens its grip and holds. The train reached Ashford Station as dawn was still deciding whether to commit to the day or retreat back into the safer obscurity of night. The sky held that particular shade of grey that belongs only to winter mornings in the English countryside. Not quite dark, not quite light, but something suspended between the two, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Frost had settled over everything during the night, transforming the station platform into something that glittered faintly in the gas lamp's glow. Each wooden plank edged with white, like the pages of an illuminated manuscript. Watson stepped down from the carriage, his breath forming clouds that hung in the still air before slowly dissipating. The cold here was different from London's damp chill. This was sharper, cleaner, the kind of cold that came from open fields and hedgerows rather than river fog and chimney smoke. It bit at his cheeks and made his eyes water, but there was something bracing about it, something that cleared the railway journey's drowsiness from his mind with the efficiency of a splash of cold water. Holmes descended after him, carpet-bag in hand, and stood for a moment surveying the platform with that sweeping gaze that missed nothing. The station-master emerging from his office with a lamp, the porter loading milk churns onto a trolley, the single hansom cab waiting at the station's entrance, and beyond, just visible in the growing light, the outline of a larger carriage, black-lacquered, and bearing what appeared to be a coat of arms on its door panel. "Our transport," Holmes observed, nodding toward the carriage. "And unless I am much mistaken, that is not merely the Carmichael family. Crest, but a modified version that includes ecclesiastical elements. The crossed keys, do you see? Suggesting either a connection to church lands or a family that held religious office during the Reformation. Grey Friars, Watson. The name itself tells a story." They approached the carriage, and a man stepped down from the driver's seat, not a coachman in livery, but someone dressed more practically in a heavy wool coat, dark trousers tucked into tall boots, and a hat pulled low against the cold. He was perhaps 40, with a face that had learned to hold expressions close, revealing nothing more than professional courtesy. His eyes, however, moved over Holmes and Watson with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating strangers. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." His voice was measured, educated, the accent holding traces of Kent, but smoothed by years of service in a household that would have required a certain polish. "I am Edmund Tovey, steward of Grey Friars. Lady Carmichael asked me to meet you personally. The household is, well, as you might expect under the circumstances." Holmes shook his hand. "Mr. Tovey, thank you for the punctuality of your telegram, and for the accommodation at this hour." "The hour seemed less important than the matter," Tovey replied, taking their bags and securing them to the carriage's rear. "If you'll come with me, gentlemen, it's a 20-minute drive to the estate, and I thought you might wish to hear some particulars before we arrive." They climbed into the carriage, which was mercifully warmed by heated bricks wrapped in flannel beneath the seats, a thoughtfulness that spoke of Lady Carmichael's attention to detail even in distress, or perhaps Tovey's own efficiency. The interior smelled of leather, wool, and very faintly of lavender, as though someone had tucked sachets into the seat cushions long ago, and they had become part of the carriage's permanent character. As they pulled away from the station, the countryside began to reveal itself in the strengthening dawn light. This was Kent at its most austere. Bare fields stretching away under frost, hedgerows standing like dark stitching against the pale earth, and here and there clusters of trees that had lost their leaves but maintained their dignity, their branches etched against the sky like careful penwork. Smoke rose from scattered farmhouses, straight columns that spoke of fires being stoked, of families rising to feed livestock and begin the day's work before full light had even arrived. Greyfriars has been in the Carmichael family since 1547, Tovey began, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had given this history before, perhaps to prospective tenants or guests. The estate comprises some 800 acres, mixed farming, woodland, and the house itself, which was built on the ruins of a Franciscan friary dissolved under Henry VIII. Lord Carmichael's great-grandfather purchased it from the Crown and built the current house, though parts of the old friary remain, the chapel, portions of the cloister wall, and the undercroft, which serves now as wine cellars and storage. Watson watched the landscape roll past, noting how the frost made everything seem both beautiful and fragile, as though one wrong breath might shatter it all. And the ice house? Tovey's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. Built by Lord Carmichael's father, around 1830. It's of the old style. Stone construction, half buried into the hillside behind the stables, with a drainage tunnel that empties into the estate's brook. His lordship used it primarily during the hunting season, for storing game, and of course for keeping ice through summer for the household's use. The ice itself is cut from the estate's pond in January and February, when it's thick enough and packed with straw. Used it, you say? Holmes observed quietly. Past tense. Lord Carmichael made use of the ice house regularly, then? He did. Yes, his lordship was particular about such things. He would inspect the stores himself, preferring not to leave such matters entirely to staff. Every Monday and Thursday, weather permitting, he would walk the grounds, the stables, the kennels, the kitchen gardens, and the ice house, a matter of routine. Tovey's hands rested on his knees, and Watson noticed they were clenched slightly, the knuckles white even in the carriage's dim interior. He was found Tuesday morning, after he failed to appear for breakfast. We searched the house first, then the grounds. The iceman had been the day before, Monday, to check the stores before the week's hunting party, and he swears the ice house was empty then and properly secured. And yet, Holmes said, his voice soft but precise, when you found Lord Carmichael, the door was bolted from the outside, with no sign of tampering. Those were your words in the telegram, Mr. Tovey. I should like to understand exactly what no sign of tampering means in this context. Tovey was silent for a moment, and in that silence the carriage turned through a pair of stone gates, each topped with a carved griffin holding a shield. The drive beyond was lined with lime trees, their bare branches meeting overhead like the ribs of some great cathedral. And at the end, perhaps a quarter-mile distant, Greyfriars itself came into view. The house was not large by the standards of great estates, but it had a solidity to it, a sense of having grown from the earth rather than being imposed upon it. Built of local grey stone that seemed to absorb the winter light, rather than reflect it. The house stood 3 stories high, with gabled windows and twisted brick chimneys from which smoke now rose in thin streams. To its left, Watson could see the ruins of what must have been the old friary chapel. Gothic arches open to the sky, walls softened by ivy even in winter, and beyond that, the darker shapes of outbuildings, stables, carriage house, and what might have been a barn. The bolt is solid iron, Tovey said finally, as the carriage slowed to navigate the drive's final curve. Threaded through the door's hasp and secured with a padlock, also iron, and one of 3 that exist for the ice house. I hold one key, the iceman holds another, and the third was kept by Lord Carmichael himself. When we found him, the bolt was in place, the padlock secured through it, and no scratches or marks on any of the metal surfaces to suggest forcing or picking. The door fits tightly. It must, to keep the cold in. And there is no other entrance. The drainage tunnel is barely 6 inches wide and runs downhill for 30 feet. No man could pass through it. Holmes leaned forward slightly. And where is Lord Carmichael's key now? In his study, in the desk drawer where he always kept it. We found it there after we broke the padlock to enter the ice house. You broke it? Holmes's tone was mild, but Watson recognized the note of interest beneath. Not unlocked it with your own key. The padlock wouldn't turn, Tovey said, and now Watson could hear genuine distress beneath the professional composure. My key fits, it always has, but when we tried to unlock it that morning, the mechanism was seized, frozen, perhaps, or rusted. We had no choice but to cut through the shackle with bolt cutters. By the time we reached him, his lordship had been dead for hours. The physician said, "Well, you'll speak with Dr. Ashdown yourselves, I expect. He's remained at the estate at Lady Carmichael's request, in case—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, as though even he wasn't certain what else the doctor's presence might prevent or cure. The carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance, where the door already stood open despite the early hour, and a woman in a dark dress and white apron waited on the threshold. Beyond her, Watson could see the warm glow of lamps lit against the morning's greyness, and smell what might have been bread baking, or perhaps porridge on the stove. The small, ordinary rituals of a household continuing even when extraordinary things had occurred. Tovey descended first and opened the carriage door, handing down their bags with the same careful efficiency he'd shown at the station. Lady Carmichael is resting, on Dr. Ashdown's orders, but she asks that you make yourselves comfortable, take breakfast, and then, when you're ready, she will receive you in the drawing-room. In the meantime, if you wish to see—" He paused, his gaze moving past the house toward the outbuildings behind. "The ice house remains as we found it, save for the broken lock. Nothing inside has been disturbed since his lordship was removed." Holmes looked in the direction of Tovey's gaze, though from here Watson could see nothing but the stable roof and the bare crowns of trees beyond. "I should very much like to see it," Holmes said quietly. "But perhaps, after we've paid our respects to Lady Carmichael and heard her account. There is a sequence to these things, and the comfort of the living must precede the interrogation of the dead." They followed the housekeeper. Mrs. Graves, she introduced herself, her voice soft as her name was grim, into the house, and Watson felt the warmth close around him like a blessing after the carriage's moderate heat and the platform's bitter cold. The entrance hall was panelled in dark oak, the floor laid with stone flags worn smooth by centuries of feet, and a wide staircase curved upward to the floors above. Portraits lined the walls, Carmichael's, presumably, going back generations, their faces stern or thoughtful, or occasionally amused, depending on the fashion and artist of their era. But it was the smell of the house that Watson noticed most. Wood smoke and beeswax polish, dried lavender and old wool, the faint mustiness of stone buildings that never quite dried out, no matter how many fires burned. And beneath it all, something else, not unpleasant, but distinctly present. Damp, perhaps, or the particular scent of a house in mourning, where the usual rhythms had been disrupted, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to tell it what happened next, how to resume, whether to grieve loudly or quietly, or at all. Mrs. Graves led them to a pair of rooms on the first floor, adjoining chambers with a shared sitting area between them, clearly reserved for guests of some standing. Each had a fire burning, fresh water in the wash basins, and windows that looked out over the estate's grounds toward what Watson now realized must be the ice house, a low stone structure barely visible among a copse of bare alders, its shape half swallowed by the hillside into which it had been built, as though the earth itself had decided to keep it partially secret. "Breakfast will be ready in the dining room in 20 minutes, Mrs. Graves said, her hands folded at her waist. "But I can have trays sent up if you gentlemen prefer privacy after your journey." "The dining room will be most welcome," Watson assured her. "Thank you, Mrs. Graves." She nodded and withdrew, her footsteps fading down the corridor with the soft precision of someone who had learned to move through a house without drawing attention to herself. A skill, Watson reflected, that must serve her particularly well in a household now wrapped in grief and suspicion. Holmes moved immediately to the window, not to admire the view, but to study it. The relationship between the house and the outbuildings, the paths that crossed the grounds, the placement of the ice house relative to everything else. Watson could see his friend's eyes tracing lines invisible to anyone else. Lines of sight, lines of movement, lines of possibility and opportunity. "An estate of 800 acres, Holmes murmured, "yet Lord Carmichael is found dead within 50 yards of his own stables, in a structure used for the most prosaic of purposes, keeping game fresh and ice available for the summer table, not murdered in some distant corner of the property, not waylaid on a country road, but here, at the heart of his own domain, in a building he visited as routine." He turned from the window, and his expression was thoughtful. Either this was a crime of extraordinary opportunity, someone taking advantage of a moment they could not have predicted, or it was planned with an intimate knowledge of Lord Carmichael's habits, his movements, his vulnerabilities. Or, Watson suggested, setting his bag on the bed and beginning to unpack his shaving kit, it was exactly what it appears to be: a tragic accident. A man entering an ice house, the door somehow closing and bolting behind him, perhaps through some mechanism we don't yet understand, and then succumbing to the cold before he could be found. Holmes smiled faintly. "Your optimism does you credit, Watson. But consider. Tovey said the padlock was seized, frozen, perhaps such that his key would not turn. Yet someone, presumably the last person to use the ice house before Lord Carmichael entered, had successfully locked it previously. Either the mechanism froze only in the hours of Monday night, or—" He paused, letting the alternative hang in the air like frost itself. "Or someone wanted it to appear frozen," Watson finished quietly. "Someone who knew we would find it locked and draw the conclusion that it had been secured from within by some impossible means. Precisely, though whether to conceal murder or to create a mystery where none exists, a diversion perhaps from some other truth that remains to be seen." Holmes pulled out his pocket watch and consulted it. 15 minutes until breakfast. Time enough to wash the train's grime away and prepare ourselves to meet Lady Carmichael. A woman who has just lost her husband under mysterious circumstances, yet who maintains enough composure to consider the comfort of visiting. Investigators with heated bricks and freshly made bread. That alone tells us something worth knowing. Watson splashed water on his face from the basin, the cold shocking but clarifying, and reached for the towel. Through the window he could see the estate's grounds growing brighter as dawn finally committed itself to day. The frost beginning to glitter properly, smoke rising from the various buildings where servants had lit fires and begun their work, and somewhere in the distance the sound of dogs barking, the kennels, probably, where hounds were being fed or exercised, or simply making their presence known to the morning. And beyond it all, half hidden among the alder trees, the ice-house waited like a question carved in stone, its heavy door closed now against prying eyes, its interior holding whatever secrets the cold had preserved. A body removed? Yes, but also a mystery sealed with a bolt and padlock, wrapped in winter's grip, and marked with the peculiar distinction of being, in Holmes's words, impossible. Watson dried his face, straightened his collar, and felt the familiar anticipation settle into his chest. Not excitement, precisely, but readiness. The sense of standing at the beginning of a path whose end he could not yet see, but trusted Holmes to illuminate, step by careful step, until the darkness gave way to understanding. Below, a bell chimed softly, the call to breakfast, to warmth and food, and the beginning of questions that needed asking. Watson picked up his jacket, shrugged it on, and turned to find Holmes already at the door, his expression composed, but his eyes bright with that particular light that meant the game, as he sometimes called it, had begun in earnest. They descended the stairs together, following the scent of bread and coffee, moving deeper into Grey Friars Estate, and the mystery it held close, like a secret told in winter's coldest whisper. The ice-house stood at the edge of the alder copse, like something that had emerged from the hillside rather than been built into it. A rounded structure of grey stone, its roof covered with earth and winter grass, so that from certain angles it appeared to be nothing more than a natural swell in the landscape. Only the heavy oak door, dark with age and moisture, and the iron fixtures that bound it, announced that this was something made by human hands for human purpose. Holmes and Watson approached it across ground that crunched beneath their boots, the frost still holding despite the strengthening morning sun. Behind them, some 30 yards distant, stood the stables, a long, low building from which came the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls and the murmur of grooms going about their morning work. The air here smelled of cold earth, wet stone, and something sharper, the scent of ice itself, that peculiar mineral quality that water takes on when frozen and stored in darkness. Tovey walked beside them, his breath forming clouds in the still air, and behind him came a younger man whom he'd introduced as Peter Ashford, the estate's iceman, a wiry fellow of perhaps 30, with the reddened hands and weathered face of someone who worked outdoors regardless of season. He held his cap in those hands now, turning it nervously as they approached the structure that had, until 2 days ago, been merely his workplace, and was now the scene of what might be murder. The door faces north, Holmes observed, pausing a few feet from the entrance. Deliberate, I assume, to minimize sun exposure and keep the interior temperature as stable as possible. "Yes, sir," Ashford said, his voice rough but respectful. "Built proper, she is. Drainage tunnel runs downhill to the brook, so meltwater don't pool. Walls are 2 foot thick, packed with straw between inner and outer stone. Keeps ice from November cutting clear through to August, if we pack her right." Holmes nodded, his gaze moving over the structure's exterior with methodical precision. The stones were fitted closely, but not mortared. Traditional icehouse construction, allowing for some air circulation while maintaining the cold. Moss grew in the cracks, and at the base, where the structure met the earth, there were marks in the frozen ground. Footprints, many of them, now preserved in the frost like fossils. "These prints," Holmes said, crouching to examine them more closely, "from when the body was discovered?" "Aye, sir," Tovey confirmed. "Myself, Ashford here, 2 of the grooms, and Dr. Ashdown. We were careful as we could be, but in the moment." He trailed off, and Watson could hear the distress beneath his professional tone, the memory of urgency, of cutting through metal, of finding what they'd hoped not to find. Holmes produced his lens and studied the ground for several long moments, occasionally shifting position to examine tracks from different angles. Watson, knowing his friend's methods, remained silent and watched the Iceman instead. Ashford stood with his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold, his eyes fixed on the door, with an expression that mixed grief, confusion, and something that might have been guilt. Though guilt for what, Watson couldn't yet determine. "Mr. Ashford," Watson said gently, "you were the last person to see Lord Carmichael alive, I understand." The Iceman's head jerked up. "No, sir. That is, I don't know. I saw him Monday afternoon, around 3 o'clock. He came to inspect the stores, same as always. But I left before he did. He was still inside when I locked up and went about my other duties." Holmes straightened from his examination of the footprints, his attention now fully on Ashford. "Describe exactly what occurred during that visit, if you would. What time you arrived, what you did, what Lord Carmichael said and did, and precisely how you secured the door when you left." Ashford swallowed, his grip tightening on his cap. "I came at 2:30, like I always do on Mondays. Check the ice levels, make sure the straw packing's sound, clear any meltwater from the drainage channel. His lordship arrived while I was inside, rearranging some blocks that had shifted. He did that sometimes, come without notice, wanting to see things as they were, not as they'd been prepared for inspection." "Did he speak to you?" "Aye. Asked about the ice quality, whether we'd have enough to last through the hunting party he was planning for February. I told him we were well stocked. Pond froze hard in January, and we'd cut near 3 tons. He seemed satisfied, walked around a bit, looking at the game we had hanging, 2 stags and some pheasants from the weekend shoot." Holmes moved to the door itself now, examining the iron hasp and the bolt that threaded through it. The padlock was gone, cut away, as Tovey had said, but the bolt remained, and Holmes studied it with the intensity of a scholar reading an ancient text. "And when you left?" "His lordship was still inside, counting the pheasants, I think. He told me to go on, that he'd secure the door himself. So I did, handed him my key, wished him good afternoon, and went to check the drainage tunnel where it empties at the brook. That's part of my routine, making sure it's not blocked with ice or debris." "You handed him your key," Holmes repeated softly. "Not his own. Ashford shifted uncomfortably. "He didn't always carry his, sir. Sometimes he'd use mine, sometimes Mr. Tovey's. Said it didn't matter which key, long as the door was properly locked. There's only the 3 of them, all identical, all cut from the same pattern when the padlocks were made." Holmes turned to Tovey. "And your key? Where was it Monday afternoon?" "On my ring, in my pocket, where it always is," Tovey said firmly. "I keep it with the other estate keys. When we couldn't open the lock Tuesday morning, I retrieved my key immediately and tried it. The key entered the lock easily enough, but the mechanism wouldn't turn. It felt seized, as though something inside had frozen or corroded overnight." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. He produced a small notebook and pencil from his coat pocket and made several quick sketches of the bolt mechanism, the door's construction, the placement of the hasp. "Mr. Tovey, I'll need to examine that broken padlock. And, Mr. Ashford, your key, please. I'd like to see it." The Iceman fumbled in his trouser pocket and produced a heavy iron key, its surface dark with age and use. Holmes took it carefully, holding it up to the light, examining the teeth and shaft with his lens. After a moment, he returned it with a nod of thanks, then turned his attention back to the door. "Let us see the interior," he said. Tovey stepped forward and pulled the door open. It moved heavily but smoothly on its hinges, revealing darkness beyond. A darkness so complete it seemed almost solid, pressing against the threshold like something physical. The temperature dropped. Immediately, a wave of cold rolling out that made Watson's eyes water and his breath catch. This was not the brisk chill of the winter morning, but something deeper, older, the concentrated cold of earth and ice sealed away from the sun's reach. Tovey produced a bullseye lantern from where it had been hanging on a nearby post and lit it with a match, the flame guttering in the cold air before steadying. The light pushed back the darkness reluctantly, revealing what lay within. The ice-house interior was perhaps 12 feet in diameter, the walls curving upward to meet in a domed ceiling some 15 feet above. Ice blocks lined the walls, great rectangular pieces of pond ice, each wrapped in straw and stacked with the precision of someone who understood the engineering of cold. The floor was packed earth, dusted with straw and what might have been sawdust, and in the centre, darker patches showed where Lord Carmichael's body had lain. Holmes entered without hesitation, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the floor more than necessary. Watson followed, the cold immediately penetrating his coat and making his old wound ache dully. The smell here was sharp and clean, ice, straw, stone, and very faintly something else, something that didn't belong in a place meant only for preservation and storage. "Spirits," Holmes said quietly, tilting his head back and inhaling slowly. "Not gin, I think. Something stronger. Brandy, perhaps, or whiskey. And—" He moved closer to where the body had lain, crouching to examine the stained earth with his lens. "Interesting." Watson joined him, his medical training asserting itself despite the cold. The stains were not just the dark patches of blood or bodily fluids one might expect from a corpse, but something more extensive, a spreading pattern that suggested prolonged contact with dampness or melting ice, yet with an irregular quality that didn't quite match natural melting patterns. "Dr. Ashdown's report," Holmes said, glancing up at Tovey, who stood in the doorway with the lantern. "You've read it?" "I have," Tovey replied. "He determined that Lord Carmichael died of exposure, hypothermia, he called it, combined with what he suspected was a blow to the head, though not a severe one. There was a bruising at the temple, consistent with a fall. The doctor's theory was that his lordship slipped on the ice, struck his head, and was unable to rise. The cold did the rest. Holmes rose and moved around the space in a slow circuit, examining the ice blocks, the hanging game, which still remained, 3 pheasants suspended from iron hooks, their feathers dulled by the cold, and the walls themselves. He paused at what appeared to be a small opening near the floor, no more than 6 inches wide. The drainage tunnel, Watson observed. Yes. Holmes crouched again, peering into the narrow opening. As described, far too small for a man to pass through and sloping downward. One could perhaps push something through it. A rope, a stick, but nothing that would allow entry or exit. He straightened and turned to face the door, measuring distances with his eyes. From where Lord Carmichael lay to the door, approximately 8 feet. A man could cross that distance in moments, even injured, unless... He paused, his expression thoughtful. Unless he couldn't. What do you mean? Watson asked. Consider the sequence, Doctor. Lord Carmichael enters this space while Mr. Ashford is still present. Ashford leaves, handing over his key. His lordship remains inside, alone. At some point, he falls, whether from slipping on ice or from some other cause, and strikes his head. The blow is not fatal, merely stunning, but now he is on the ground, in a space where the temperature is near freezing, possibly below. How long would it take for hypothermia to set in under such conditions? Watson calculated quickly. Depending on his clothing and the severity of the head injury, anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. But a man in distress, even injured, would surely cry out, attempt to reach the door, make some effort to save himself. Unless he couldn't, Holmes repeated, his voice soft but certain. Because the door was already secured, already bolted from the outside. The implication hung in the cold air like frost itself. Tovy's face paled, and even Ashford, standing behind the steward, seemed to shrink into himself. But that would mean, Tovy said slowly, that someone sealed him in deliberately, that someone knew he was inside and locked the door regardless. Or, Holmes said, moving back toward the entrance, his boots crunching on the straw-dusted floor, that someone ensured he would enter and ensured he wouldn't leave, which transforms this from a tragic accident or a mysterious impossibility into something far more prosaic, though no less tragic. Murder, planned with patient malice, and executed with an understanding of cold, of metal, and of routine. He stepped out into the morning light, and Watson followed gratefully, the warmth of the sun feeling almost painfully bright after the ice-house's darkness. Holmes stood for a moment, his eyes closed, breathing in the clean winter air as though clearing his lungs of the cold and the scent of death that lingered within. Mr. Tovey, he said, opening his eyes, I shall need to speak with Dr. Ashdown immediately, and then with Lady Carmichael. I shall also need that broken padlock, the keys, all 3 of them, and a detailed accounting of Lord Carmichael's movements throughout Monday. Who saw him, where, and when? Every interaction, every word spoken, every deviation from routine, no matter how minor. Of course, Tovey said, his professional composure reasserting itself despite the pallor of his face. I'll have everything ready within the hour. And Mr. Ashford, Holmes added, turning to the Iceman, you'll remain available for further questions, say, Nothing to anyone about what we've discussed here. This investigation has just begun, and I would prefer that whoever secured that door believes their method remains mysterious, their reasoning unknown." He smiled faintly. People who believe they've created an impossible crime are often careless in other ways, thinking the impossibility itself is protection enough. They walked back toward the house, through grounds that now seemed less peaceful and more watchful, as though the estate itself had become aware that something wrong had occurred within its boundaries, something that demanded accounting. The dogs in the kennels had fallen silent, and the smoke rising from the chimneys seemed less homely and more like signals sent to a sky that might or might not answer. Watson glanced back once at the ice house, that rounded shape half swallowed by earth, and thought about the cold darkness within, about a man dying slowly on frozen ground, while above him the winter night passed, and no one came, no one heard, no one knew, until morning brought discovery and questions, and with them Sherlock Holmes, who looked at impossibilities and saw instead the simple, ugly logic of human malice dressed in the costume of mystery. The game, as Holmes called it, had indeed begun, and like all the games they'd played before, Watson suspected this one would end not with triumph, but with sadness. The revelation that made sense of mystery but couldn't undo what had been done, could not warm what had grown cold, could not bring back what winter and wickedness had taken away. The estate office occupied a corner of Greyfriars' ground floor, its windows looking out over the kitchen gardens, where frost-blackened stalks of what had been summer vegetables stood like thin monuments to warmer months. The room itself held the particular atmosphere of a space devoted to practical matters. A large oak desk covered with ledgers and correspondence, shelves lined with record books dating back decades, and a fireplace where coals burned low, as though even here economy was practiced as a matter of principle. Dr. Ashdown sat in one of the leather chairs near the fire, a teacup balanced on his knee, steam rising from it in delicate spirals. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the solid build and steady hands of a country physician who'd delivered babies and closed the eyes of the dying in equal measure for 30 years. His face bore the particular lines that came from being called out in all weathers and at all hours, and his eyes held the patient weariness of someone who understood that medicine could explain death without making it any less painful for those who grieved. Holmes sat across from him, his own cup untouched on the small table at his elbow, his attention focused entirely on the doctor's words. Watson stood by the window, ostensibly admiring the gardens, but in truth watching the household staff move about their duties, a maid carrying linens, a gardener inspecting the glass houses, a stable boy leading a horse toward the paddock. Life continuing, as it always did, around and through grief. The body temperature was the first thing that struck me as peculiar, Dr. Ashdown was saying, his voice carrying the measured tone of professional observation. When I examined Lord Carmichael at approximately 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, some 3 hours after discovery, his core temperature was 31 degrees. Cold, certainly, but not as cold as I would have expected for a man who'd spent what I estimated to be 12 to 14 hours in a space where the ambient temperature was near freezing. "You would have expected colder?" Holmes asked. "I would have expected frozen, Mr. Holmes, at least partially. The extremities, fingers, toes, nose, ears, should have shown clear signs of frostbite, if not actual freezing. Yet they didn't. The skin was pale and waxy, yes, but the tissue damage was consistent with hypothermia, not with prolonged exposure to temperatures below freezing. It was as though... He paused, searching for the right words. As though he'd been cold, but not quite cold enough, for just long enough. Holmes leaned forward slightly. You mentioned a head injury in your report. Yes. Contusion to the right temple, approximately 2 inches in diameter, with subdermal bruising consistent with a fall or blow. Not severe enough to cause unconsciousness for more than a few minutes, in my professional opinion, but enough to disorient him, perhaps make coordination difficult. The skull was not fractured. And the smell of spirits that Mr. Tovey reported? Dr. Ashdown frowned, setting his teacup aside. I noticed it as well, though faintly. Lord Carmichael's breath and clothing both carried the scent of alcohol. Brandy, I believe, though I couldn't swear to it. His blood alcohol content, had I the means to measure it precisely, was likely elevated. Not drunk, you understand, but having consumed perhaps 2 or 3 glasses over the course of the afternoon and evening. Was that typical of his habits? Lord Carmichael enjoyed his brandy, the doctor said carefully, but I would not have called him intemperate. He kept regular hours, maintained his health well enough for a man of 53, and I'd never known him to drink to excess. The amount in his system was notable, but not extraordinary. Watson turned from the window. Could the alcohol have contributed to his inability to save himself? Impaired judgment, reduced reaction to the cold. Certainly, Dr. Ashdown agreed. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, which creates a sensation of warmth while actually increasing heat loss. Combined with the head injury, even a moderate amount of drink could have significantly impaired his ability to recognize the danger he was in or to act effectively to escape it. Holmes rose and moved to the desk, where Tovey had laid out the items Holmes had requested. The broken padlock, its shackle cut cleanly through with bolt cutters, and 3 identical iron keys arranged in a row like evidence in a trial. He picked up the padlock carefully, examining the mechanism with his lens. The lock was seized when you attempted to open it, he said, his voice directed at Tovey, who stood near the door with the posture of a man prepared to be useful at a moment's notice. Describe the sensation more precisely, if you would. Tovey stepped forward, his brow furrowed with the effort of recall. The key entered easily enough. The keyhole wasn't blocked or frozen over. But when I tried to turn it, there was resistance. Not the resistance of a lock that's been forced or damaged, but rather, it felt as though the mechanism inside had swollen somehow, or contracted, so that the parts no longer aligned properly. I applied significant force, enough that I feared breaking the key itself, but it would not budge. And yet, Holmes murmured, still examining the lock, when this mechanism was installed and tested, it functioned perfectly. When Mr. Ashford locked the door Monday afternoon, it functioned perfectly. Something changed between Monday at 3 o'clock and Tuesday at 6 in the morning. Something that caused the internal components to shift or bind in such a way that a key which had always worked ceased to work. He set down the lock and picked up one of the keys, holding it up to the morning light streaming through the window. Iron. Good quality, but iron nonetheless. And iron, like all metals, expands when heated and contracts when cooled. Watson felt understanding begin to dawn, cold and clear as the morning itself. The temperature. Precisely, Watson, though not in the way one might first assume. Holmes set down the key and turned to face them all. Dr. Ashdown in his chair, Tovey by the door, and Watson by the window. Consider the physics of the situation. A padlock mechanism consists of multiple metal components fitted together with precision. The shackle, the locking pins, the springs, the cylinder, all iron or steel. Now imagine that mechanism is subjected to temperatures well below freezing for an extended period. What happens to the metal? It contracts, Watson said. The cold causes the metal to shrink, even if only minutely. Yes, and if the contraction is uniform across all components, the lock continues to function. But if the components contract at slightly different rates, or if moisture enters the mechanism and freezes, expanding while the metal around it contracts. Holmes gestured at the broken padlock. The result is a lock that appears undamaged, but will not open. A lock that seems to have sealed itself by some impossible means. Dr. Ashdown leaned forward, interest lighting his weathered features. You're suggesting the cold itself created the locked room? I'm suggesting, Holmes said carefully, that someone with knowledge of such principles might exploit them. Consider a lock that functions perfectly in moderate temperatures, but seizes in extreme cold. A door that, once closed, cannot be opened from within because it has no interior handle. A victim rendered vulnerable through drink and injury, trapped in a space where the temperature itself becomes the murder weapon. No violence necessary beyond that initial blow to the head, no struggle, simply patience, and an understanding of how iron behaves when the temperature drops. The room was silent for a long moment, save for the soft settling of coals in the grate. Watson found himself thinking of the ice house's interior, that dark, cold space where time itself seemed to slow, where a man might lie conscious for minutes or even hours, understanding what was happening to him, but unable to prevent it. A death that was murder in all but the final instrument, not a knife or a gun or poison, but winter itself and the properties of frozen metal. But the timing, Tovey said, his voice uncertain. How could anyone control when Lord Carmichael would enter the ice house, or ensure he'd be alone, or... Routine, Holmes interrupted gently. You yourself told us that Lord Carmichael visited the ice house every Monday and Thursday, that he preferred to inspect alone, that he was, in your words, particular about such things. A murderer need not control every variable if the victim's own habits provide the structure. They need only prepare the stage and wait for the performance to occur. Watson moved from the window to join the group near the fire. You're suggesting someone tampered with the padlock beforehand, altered it somehow so that it would seize once the temperature dropped. Not tampered, necessarily. But consider, what if the lock was deliberately exposed to moisture before being secured? Water enters the mechanism, the door is closed and locked at, say, 3:30 Monday afternoon, when the temperature is above freezing. As night falls and the temperature plummets, that moisture freezes, expands, and binds the internal components. By morning, the lock appears undamaged, but will not open. Meanwhile, inside... He didn't need to finish the sentence. Dr. Ashdown set down his teacup with a soft clink. It's diabolical. It's physics, Holmes corrected, though not unkindly, which can be diabolical enough in the wrong hands. Dr. Ashdown, did you notice any moisture on or around the padlock when you arrived Tuesday morning? The doctor frowned. thinking back. There was frost, certainly. Everything was covered in frost that morning, but actual moisture, water, I couldn't say. I was focused on reaching Lord Carmichael, not on documenting the lock's condition. Understandable. Holmes returned to the desk and picked up the estate ledgers that Tovey had provided, beginning to page through them with quick efficiency. Now we come to the question of motive. Mr. Tovey, you mentioned in the carriage that there were financial complications, debts, land disputes. I should like to hear more about that, and about who stood to gain from Lord Carmichael's death. Tovey's expression tightened, and he glanced at Dr. Ashdown as though seeking permission to speak candidly. The doctor gave a small nod, and Tovey moved fully into the room, his hands clasped behind his back, in the posture of someone delivering an unpleasant report. Greyfriars has been struggling financially for the past 3 years. A series of poor harvests, followed by necessary repairs to the main house after a fire in the west wing. Lord Carmichael borrowed against the estate to cover the costs. Then there were the investments. What sort of investments? Watson asked. A railway venture in India, mining operations in Wales, both recommended by a business associate in London, a Mr. Gerald Wickham. Both failed spectacularly. The debts accumulated to approximately £12,000. Holmes looked up from the ledger, his eyebrows raised. A considerable sum. Ruinous, Tovey said, flatly. Lord Carmichael was attempting to negotiate with the creditors, but several had lost patience. There was talk of forced sale, of the estate being broken up and parcelled out. Her ladyship was distraught, though she tried to hide it. The hunting party Lord Carmichael was planning for February was intended as a final effort to secure new investors, to demonstrate that Greyfriars was still viable, still worth preserving. And his death? Holmes asked quietly. How does that affect the estate's situation? There is an insurance policy, £20,000, payable to Lady Carmichael, enough to settle the debts and provide for her security, though not enough to maintain the estate as it was. She would have to sell, likely to divide the property among several buyers, but she would not be destitute. The implications sat heavy in the room. Watson felt the weight of them. A wife made comfortable by a husband's death, a steward whose position would end when the estate was sold, servants who would need to seek new positions, creditors who might receive payment from an insurance claim, but nothing more. A web of motives, each thread crossing and recrossing the others, impossible to follow to any single source without pulling them all taut and seeing which held firm and which snapped. Holmes closed the ledger with a soft thump. I shall need to speak with Lady Carmichael. Is she well enough to receive us? I believe so, Dr. Ashdown said, rising from his chair with the slight stiffness of a man who'd been sitting too long. I checked on her this morning, and though she's grieving, she's composed. She specifically asked to speak with you as soon as you felt ready. Said she wanted... He paused, choosing his words carefully. She wanted the truth, whatever it might be. Even if the truth was painful. The truth usually is, Holmes said quietly. He gathered the keys from the desk, slipping them into his coat pocket, and gestured for Watson to join him. Mr. Tovey, I should also like a list of everyone who was on the estate grounds, Monday afternoon and evening. Staff, visitors, tradesmen, everyone, and their movements, if you can reconstruct them. I'll have it prepared within the hour, Tovey promised. They left the office and moved through the house's corridors, following Dr. Ashdown toward the drawing room where Lady Carmichael waited. The house seemed quieter now than it had at breakfast, as though the morning's routines had been completed, and the afternoon stretched ahead like a question no one quite knew how to answer. Somewhere upstairs, a clock chimed the half-hour, 11:30, the day approaching noon, but the winter sun still pale and distant, offering light without much warmth. Watson found himself thinking of the ice house again, of how someone might plan such a murder. The careful consideration of temperature and metal, the patience required to wait for routine to deliver the victim to the prepared trap, the cold, calculation that chose freezing over more direct violence. It spoke of intelligence, certainly, but also of a particular kind of cruelty, the willingness to let someone die slowly, aware of their fate, unable to prevent it. And somewhere in this house, or on these grounds, that person moved and breathed and went about their day, believing perhaps that the impossible nature of the locked room would protect them, that no one could unravel what winter and physics had woven together into a mystery sealed as tight as the ice house's heavy door. But they had not reckoned on Holmes, who looked at impossibilities and saw instead the simple, observable truth that all things followed natural law, and natural law could be understood, could be traced backward from effect to cause, from the frozen lock to the hand that had prepared it, from the dead man in the ice to whoever had ensured he would enter and would not leave, and would die as winter tightened its grip and held. Lady Carmichael sat in a high-backed chair near the drawing-room's tall windows, the winter light falling across her face in a way that revealed both her composure and the cost of maintaining it. She was perhaps 45, dressed in black silk that rustled faintly when she moved, her dark hair arranged with careful severity, and her hands, thin, pale hands that bore a single wedding band, folded in her lap with the stillness of someone who had learned that movement sometimes revealed more than one wished to show. The drawing-room itself was elegant, but not ostentatious. Cream-coloured walls hung with watercolours of the estate's grounds in better seasons, furniture upholstered in dark green velvet, and a fire burning in the marble fireplace with the steady warmth of coals tended by someone who understood that grief required neither cold nor excessive heat, but simply continuation. A silver tea service sat on the low table, steam rising from the pot in thin, translucent ribbons. Dr. Ashdown had made the introductions and then withdrawn, citing other patients in the village who required his attention, though Watson suspected the doctor simply understood that some conversations were better held without witnesses whose professional presence might constrain what could be said. Holmes and Watson sat across from Lady Carmichael, and for a moment no one spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, but rather weighted with the understanding that what would be discussed required acknowledgment before words could begin. "Mr. Holmes," Lady Carmichael said finally, her voice steady and low, cultured without being affected. "Dr. Watson, thank you for coming so quickly. I realize the circumstances are irregular. Most women in my position would wait for the local constabulary to conclude their investigation before seeking outside assistance. But the constabulary has concluded nothing except that my husband's death is mysterious, and mystery is a luxury I cannot afford at present." Holmes inclined his head. "I understand, Lady Carmichael, and I appreciate your candour. May I begin by expressing my condolences for your loss?" "You may," she said, and something in her tone suggested she'd received many such condolences already, and found them well-meaning, but ultimately hollow. "And you may also proceed directly to questions, Mr. Holmes. I am not so fragile that courtesy requires you to avoid the unpleasant particulars. My husband is dead. Someone may have killed him. Those facts require investigation, not delicacy." Watson found himself warming to her immediately, not because grief had made her cold, but because she possessed the particular clarity that sometimes came to people in crisis. The understanding that truth, however painful, was preferable to comfortable evasion. "Very well," Holmes said, settling back in his chair with the ease of someone granted permission to be direct. "Your husband's financial difficulties. Were you aware of their extent?" "I was." "Are ye?" Carmichael reached for the teapot and poured 3 cups with steady hands, adding milk to her own without asking their preferences, a small failure of hospitality that suggested her mind was elsewhere, focused on matters more pressing than social grace. Though Edward tried to shield me from the worst of it, he was proud, Mr. Holmes. Not in a vain way, but in the way of men who built their sense of self upon competence and provision. To admit that the investments had failed, that the debts were mounting, that Grey Friars might be lost. She paused, sipping her tea. It wounded him more deeply than he could articulate. "The investments," Watson said gently. "Mr. Tovey mentioned a Mr. Gerald Wickham." Lady Carmichael's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. "Gerald Wickham is a scoundrel who preys on men like my husband, educated, principled men who understand land and agriculture, but lack the particular cynicism required to navigate London's financial circles. He presented opportunities that seemed sound. Railway expansion in territories where British interests were secure, mining ventures with geological surveys and government approvals. Edward invested on the strength of Wickham's assurances and his own desire to secure Grey Friars' future. And when the ventures failed? Wickham expressed regret, cited unforeseen complications, political instability in India, unexpected flooding in the Welsh mines, and suggested further investments to recoup the losses. Edward, to his credit, refused. But the damage was done. £12,000, Mr. Holmes, against an estate that generates perhaps £800 annually after expenses. We were facing ruin. Holmes set down his teacup untouched. The insurance policy that Mr. Tovey mentioned, £20,000. Were you aware of it? I was. Edward took it out 3 years ago, when he first borrowed against the estate. He said— Her voice faltered for the first time, and she paused to steady it. He said he wanted to ensure that whatever happened, I would not be left destitute, that Grey Friars might be lost, but I would have security. At the time, I thought it morbid. Now I understand it was simply practical and prescient. Lady Carmichael, Holmes said, his voice carrying a gentleness that Watson rarely heard. I must ask a question that will seem indelicate, but its answer is necessary. Did your husband give any indication that he was considering taking his own life? She met his gaze directly, her grey eyes steady. No, Mr. Holmes. Edward was many things, proud, worried, perhaps even despairing about the estate's future. But he was not suicidal. He spoke often of plans, of strategies to salvage what we could, of the hunting party in February as a final effort. those are not the words of a man preparing to end his life. And more to the point, she set down her teacup with a soft click. Edward would never have chosen such a method. To lock himself in the ice house and freeze to death? It's too slow, too uncertain, too theatrical. If he had wished to die, he would have used his hunting rifle quickly and cleanly in a place where he would be found without causing unnecessary distress. Not this. Holmes nodded slowly, as though her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then we proceed on the assumption that his death was not self-inflicted. Which brings us to the more difficult question. Who might have wished him dead? Besides myself, you mean? Lady Carmichael's tone was dry, almost amused. Since I am the one who benefits most directly from his death, and since I know enough about locked room mysteries from reading the Strand magazine to understand how suspicion works. The thought had occurred to me, Holmes admitted. Then let me address it directly. I did not kill my husband, Mr. Holmes. I loved him, despite his faults and his financial mismanagement and his stubborn pride. More practically, I lack both the physical strength to have moved him if he'd resisted, and the technical knowledge to have created your impossible locked room. I can barely manage the household accounts, much less engineer a murder that requires understanding metal contraction and temperature physics. Noted, Holmes said, though I observe you've given the matter some thought. I've given everything about Edward's death considerable thought. It's preferable to simply sitting and grieving without purpose. She straightened in her chair. As to who else might have had motive. Mr. Tovey, whose position ends when the estate is sold, though he would receive a reference and 3 months' wages. The creditors, though Edward's death actually improves their chances of payment through the insurance settlement. Gerald Wickham, if he feared Edward might pursue legal action over the failed investments, though I doubt Edward would have. The scandal would have been worse than the debt, and... She hesitated, then continued. There is Edward's cousin, Philip Carmichael, who inherits the title, though not the estate itself. The title is hereditary, the property is not. Philip has always been resentful of Edward's position, though whether resentful enough to commit murder, I couldn't say. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Is Philip Carmichael currently in residence here? No, he lives in Sussex and hasn't visited Greyfriars in 2 years, though he did write to Edward 3 weeks ago requesting a loan of £500. Edward declined. Watson made a note in his small notebook, the pencil scratching softly in the quiet room. Outside the window, a gardener passed, carrying pruning shears, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. And somewhere in the house, a door closed with a distant thump that spoke of servants going about their duties in rooms the family rarely entered. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze following the gardener's progress toward the glass houses. Lady Carmichael, I should like to ask about Monday afternoon. Your husband's movements, and your own. When did you last see him alive? She thought for a moment, her expression distant with recollection. At luncheon. We ate together in the small dining room, soup, cold meat, bread, and cheese. Nothing elaborate. Edward was preoccupied, reading correspondence while he ate, which he knew irritated me, but which I'd long since stopped commenting upon. After lunch, perhaps at 1 o'clock, he retired to his study to work on the accounts. I went to the morning room to write letters. We did not speak again. Did you hear him leave the house? No, though I wouldn't have necessarily. The study has its own external door that leads to the terrace. Edward often used it when going to inspect the grounds. He said it saved him walking through the house and being waylaid by servants with questions. If he left that way, I wouldn't have heard. And your own movements for the remainder of the afternoon and evening? Lady Carmichael's recitation was precise, the timeline of a day that had seemed ordinary until it revealed itself to be anything but. Letters written until 3 o'clock. Tea taken in the drawing-room at 4, alone, since Edward had not appeared. A walk in the garden at 5, despite the cold, because the confinement of the house had begun to feel oppressive. Dinner at 7:30, served in the small dining-room, though Edward's place remained empty. Not unusual, she noted, as he sometimes took a tray in his study when absorbed in work. By 9 o'clock, when he still had not appeared, she'd sent Tovey to inquire. Tovey had found the study empty, the account books open on the desk, and Edward nowhere in the house. A search of the grounds had been initiated, but abandoned when darkness fell. They'd assumed he'd walked to the village and been delayed, perhaps stopped at the inn for a drink with the local farmers, something he did, occasionally, maintaining connections with tenants and labourers. We weren't alarmed, Lady Carmichael said quietly. Or rather, we were mildly concerned, but not frightened. It was only when morning came and Edward had not returned, when his bed had not been slept in, that true fear set in. And then the search, and the discovery at the ice house, and... She trailed off, her hands tightening in her lap. Holmes turned from the window. The ice house is not visible from the main house, I noticed, nor from the morning room where you were writing letters. If someone had been moving about the ice house area Monday afternoon, you would not have seen them. No, the stables and outbuildings block the view. You'd have to walk around to the east lawn to see that portion of the grounds. Did you do so during your walk at 5 o'clock? She shook her head. I stayed to the formal gardens on the south side. The east grounds are primarily functional. Stables, kennels, storage buildings. Not particularly pleasant for evening strolls. Holmes nodded, absorbing this information with the focused attention he gave to all details that might later prove significant. Watson watched his friend's face, recognizing the expression that meant pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into patterns, though the full picture remained obscure. One final question for now, Holmes said. The blue sealing wax on the telegram that brought me here, uncommon and scented with pine, camphor, and what I believe was ether or chloroform. Is such wax used regularly in the household's correspondence? Lady Carmichael's eyebrows rose slightly. No, our household uses red wax, as do most families. The blue wax belongs to Dr. Ashdown. It was given to him by a colleague who practices in London and has eccentric tastes. The doctor occasionally uses our writing desk when he visits, and he must have left a stick of his wax here. As for the scent, she frowned. Dr. Ashdown often carries medical supplies with him. Perhaps the wax absorbed the smell from proximity to his bag. Though why Tovey would have used it for the telegram, I couldn't say. Perhaps he simply reached for whatever wax was closest when preparing the message. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, brief but meaningful. Another small thread, another detail that might connect to others or might dissolve into irrelevance, but worth noting regardless. "Thank you, Lady Carmichael," Holmes said, returning to his chair. You've been more helpful than you know. I have several more avenues to explore, and then I shall need to conduct a small experiment that will, I hope, demonstrate how your husband's death was accomplished. It will require the use of the kitchen, some household items, and the presence of those who were involved in discovering the body. Can that be arranged for this afternoon, perhaps at 3 o'clock? Of course. I'll inform Mrs. Graves and Mr. Tovey. Lady Carmichael rose, and Holmes and Watson rose with her. She regarded them both for a long moment, her expression composed, but her eyes holding something that might have been hope, or might simply have been the desire for conclusion, for understanding, for the ability to move forward from mystery into the painful but at least comprehensible territory of truth. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "whatever you discover, I would prefer to know it fully and completely. Even if the truth implicates someone I know, someone I trust, or—" She paused. "Even if it reflects poorly on Edward himself. The worst thing is not knowing. The worst thing is this suspension between accident and murder, between innocence and guilt. Can you give me truth, even if it's ugly?" "That," Holmes said gently, "is the only kind of truth there is, Lady Carmichael. And yes, I believe I can provide it. Before the day is over, the mystery of the ice house will be mystery no longer. Whether that brings you peace or merely different pain, I cannot promise. But it will bring you certainty, and sometimes that is all we can hope for." She nodded once, sharply, and left the room with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived one impossible thing, and was prepared to survive whatever came next. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Holmes stood silent for a moment, staring at the space where she'd been, as though her absence itself contained information worth examining. "Well, Watson," he said finally, "your impression of Lady Carmichael as potential murderer?" Watson considered carefully before answering. "She's intelligent enough to plan such a thing, composed enough to carry it through, and she certainly benefits from her husband's death. But—" he shook his head, "I don't believe she did it." There was genuine grief in her voice when she spoke of him, despite the practical way she discussed the financial situation, and her point about lacking the technical knowledge rings true. This murder required an understanding of physics and metal properties that I doubt she possesses. "I concur," Holmes said, "though we must remember that the technical knowledge need not belong to the person who desired Lord Carmichael's death. An intelligent plan executed by skilled hands, but conceived by someone else? That remains possible. Still, my suspicions lie elsewhere." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Come, Watson. We have 3 hours before the demonstration, time enough to examine the estate's records more thoroughly, to speak with Mr. Ashford again, and perhaps—" a faint smile crossed his face. "Perhaps to conduct a small test involving a kettle, a basin of snow, and the peculiar properties of iron when subjected to extremes of temperature. The game, as I believe I've mentioned before, is very nearly afoot. Or rather, the game is nearly concluded, and all that remains is to demonstrate to others what the evidence has already whispered to those willing to listen carefully." They left the drawing-room and moved deeper into Greyfriars, toward whatever revelations the afternoon would bring, toward truth that would be ugly but certain, toward the moment when mystery would crack open like ice in spring, and reveal the cold, simple logic of murder that had hidden beneath the appearance of impossibility. The kitchen at Greyfriars occupied the back corner of the house's ground floor, a large, stone-flagged room that held the accumulated warmth of decades of cooking. Bread baked, stews simmered, kettles boiled, for endless pots of tea. The great iron range dominated one wall, its surface crowded now with the copper kettle Holmes had requested, steam beginning to rise from its spout in a thin, wavering plume. On the long wooden table in the centre of the room sat a basin filled with snow that Ashford had fetched from the north-facing slope behind the stables, and beside it an iron bolt and padlock identical in every particular to those that had sealed the ice-house door. Holmes stood at the table. Like a lecturer before students, his sleeves rolled back, his expression focused but calm. Around him, arranged in a loose semicircle, stood the household. Lady Carmichael, composed in her black silk. Tovey, his face carefully neutral. Mrs. Graves, her hands folded in her apron. Ashford, the iceman, turning his cap between nervous fingers. And two grooms who had helped discover the body. Young men with wind-burned faces who stood with the awkward stillness of those unused to being summoned indoors for anything but reprimand. Watson positioned himself near the window, where he could observe both Holmes's demonstration and the faces of those watching, noting reactions, cataloguing expressions. The afternoon light slanted through the glass, pale and cold, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the warm kitchen air like tiny, aimless spirits. "Thank you all for gathering," Holmes began, his voice carrying easily in the stone room. "What I'm about to show you is not magic, nor is it particularly complex. It is simply physics, the behavior of metal under temperature extremes, applied with knowledge and malicious intent. By the end of this demonstration, you will understand exactly how Lord Carmichael was murdered, and why the locked room appeared impossible when it was, in fact, quite simple." He picked up the padlock, holding it so all could see. Iron, when exposed to cold, contracts. The contraction is minute, mere fractions of a millimetre, but in a mechanism as precisely fitted as a padlock, those fractions are sufficient to cause binding, to prevent the tumblers from aligning, to render the lock inoperable, even though it appears undamaged. He turned to Ashford. "Mr. Ashford, when you locked the ice-house Monday afternoon, was there anything unusual about the padlock's operation?" "No, sir," Ashford said, his voice rough. "Locked smooth as always. Key turned, bolt slid through, padlock secured. Same as I'd done 100 times before." "Precisely, because at that moment the padlock had not yet been subjected to the temperature extreme that would cause it to seize." Holmes placed the padlock and bolt into the basin of snow, pushing them down until they were completely submerged in the white mass. "Now we wait. While the metal cools, let me describe what I believe occurred Monday afternoon." He began to pace slowly along the table's length, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice taking on the narrative quality of someone reconstructing a sequence of events with absolute certainty. Lord Carmichael entered the ice-house at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, after Mr. Ashford had completed his inspection and departed. His lordship was alone, as was his custom. But he was not entirely himself. He had consumed several glasses of brandy over the course of the afternoon, enough to slightly impair his judgment and coordination, though not enough to render him obviously intoxicated. Lady Carmichael's expression tightened, but she said nothing. "While inside the ice-house," Holmes continued, "examining the stores, or perhaps simply taking a moment away from the house and its pressures, Lord Carmichael slipped on the ice-slicked floor and struck his head against one of the ice blocks or the stone wall. The blow was not severe. Dr. Ashdown confirmed this. But it was sufficient to stun him, to leave him disoriented and slow to react. Holmes paused at the end of the table, turning to face his audience. Here is where the murder truly began. The door to the ice house was pulled shut from the outside, not slammed, not forced, but simply closed firmly until the latch engaged. And then, and this is the crucial point, the bolt was threaded through the hasp and the padlock secured through the bolt's eye, exactly as it should be, exactly as Mr. Ashford had done countless times before. "But the lock seized," Tovey said, his voice uncertain. "It wouldn't open Tuesday morning." "It seized," Holmes agreed, "because between Monday afternoon and Tuesday morning the temperature dropped to well below freezing, and the padlock, which had been deliberately prepared to seize under such conditions, did exactly what it was designed to do, or rather, what someone had modified it to do." He moved to the range and carefully lifted the copper kettle, carrying it back to the table. Steam rose from the spout, and the scent of heated metal joined the kitchen's familiar smells. "Mr. Tovey, if you would bring me the broken padlock from the office." Tovey nodded and hurried from the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the corridor beyond. In his absence, Holmes reached into the snow basin and withdrew the bolt and padlock, both now thoroughly chilled, frost forming on their surfaces. He held them up, and even from where Watson stood, he could see how the metal seemed darker, duller, the cold making it look almost brittle. "Observe," Holmes said, and he took one of the identical keys from his pocket and attempted to insert it into the padlock's keyhole. The key entered, but when he tried to turn it, there was visible resistance. He applied more pressure, his face reflecting the effort, but the mechanism would not budge. "Seized, just as Mr. Tovey found Monday morning. The cold has caused the internal components to contract, to bind against each other. A key that worked perfectly at room temperature is now useless." Tovey returned with the broken padlock, placing it on the table beside the basin. Holmes picked it up, examining it once more under the afternoon light. "But here is the question that troubled me from the beginning. Why would a padlock that had functioned reliably for years suddenly seize? Metal contraction alone is insufficient. These locks were designed for use on an ice house, built to withstand cold temperatures. Unless—" He set down the broken lock and picked up a small bottle from the table's edge, one Watson recognized as containing lamp oil. "Unless someone had introduced a foreign substance into the mechanism. Not enough to prevent operation at moderate temperatures, but enough to freeze solid when subjected to extreme cold, thereby binding the moving parts beyond the ability of contraction alone." He tilted the bottle over the chilled padlock, allowing a few drops of oil to fall onto its surface. The oil itself would not be noticed in casual inspection. It would appear as normal lubrication. But when frozen, it becomes viscous, almost solid, creating additional resistance that makes the lock inoperable. "But who would have done such a thing?" Mrs. Graves asked, her voice sharp with distress. "And when? The padlocks are kept in Mr. Tovey's office when not in use." "Not always," Holmes said quietly, and his gaze moved to Tovey, whose face had gone pale. "Mr. Tovey, you have keys to all the estate's buildings and mechanisms. You have access to the padlocks at all times. You understand the routine of the ice house, Lord, Carmichael's habits, the schedules of staff and visitors. And you were aware, intimately aware, of the estate's dire financial situation. Tovy's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His hands clenched at his sides. "The forged will," Holmes continued, his voice still quiet, but carrying a weight that seemed to press against the warm kitchen air. "Hidden beneath the straw in the ice house, meant to be discovered after Lord Carmichael's death. A will that would have left the estate not to Lady Carmichael to be sold and scattered, but to a trust administered by the steward, yourself, with provisions for maintaining Greyfriars intact, preserving your position, ensuring the staff's employment. A will that would have solved all problems, except for the small matter of being entirely fraudulent." Watson moved slightly, positioning himself between Tovey and the door, though the steward made no move to flee. Instead, he seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging, his carefully maintained composure crumbling like frost under sun. "I found the document this morning," Holmes said, producing a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Exactly where I expected it to be, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked between the ice blocks and the outer wall, precisely positioned to be discovered during the next routine clearing of the ice house in spring. A will supposedly written by Lord Carmichael, leaving his estate in trust, signed and witnessed, though the witnesses' names are those of men who died years ago, a detail you perhaps thought would not be scrutinized closely if the document appeared otherwise legitimate. I didn't mean." Tovey's voice was barely a whisper. "I never meant for him to die. I only thought." "You thought," Holmes said, and now there was something almost gentle in his tone, "that you could create circumstances that would force Lady Carmichael to accept the forged will as genuine. That faced with scandal or lengthy legal proceedings, she would concede. But you needed leverage. You needed Lord Carmichael's death to appear mysterious, impossible, worthy of investigation that would lead to the discovery of the will among his private papers or possessions. A death that seemed like accident or misadventure, but strange enough to warrant thorough examination of the estate and all its documents. Lady Carmichael had risen from her chair, her face white, but her voice steady. "You killed my husband for a forgery? For a position as steward?" "For the estate," Tovey said, and now tears ran down his face, though his voice held no pleading, only a terrible weariness. "For Greyfriars, which your husband was destroying through incompetence and pride. For the staff who would lose their positions, the tenants who would be displaced when the land was parcelled out. I served this estate for 20 years, my lady. I watched it decline, watched the debts mount, watched Lord Carmichael make one foolish decision after another. And I thought I could save it. I thought if I could just—" He broke off, his hands covering his face. The kitchen was silent, save for the soft hiss of the kettle on the range and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the house's depths. Watson felt the familiar sadness that always came at this moment, when mystery became comprehensible, when the impossible revealed itself as merely human, when murder showed its face not as grand villainy, but as desperation and foolishness wearing the mask of righteousness. Holmes set down the frozen padlock with a soft clink. "You will confess this to the magistrate, Mr. Tovey. You will explain how you prepared the padlock, how you ensured Lord Carmichael would enter the ice house alone, how you closed and secured the door, knowing he was injured and unable to prevent it, how you returned hours later in darkness, and used the kettle method I've just demonstrated." He gestured at the steaming copper vessel. To warm the padlock sufficiently that your key would turn, allowing you to relock it properly after adding the oil that would cause it to seize again by morning. A complicated plan, but one that nearly succeeded in appearing impossible. Tovey lowered his hands, his face wet with tears, but his expression resolute. I will confess. I will tell them everything, but I want it known. His voice caught. I want it known that I never wished to harm him. I only wanted to save what he was destroying. I wanted... Irrelevant, Holmes said, not unkindly. Your intentions, your justifications, they don't restore life or undo death. They are simply the reasons behind the cold and the locked door and a man dying alone while winter tightened its grip. Nothing more. The demonstration was ended, and truth had been delivered as promised, ugly, certain, and complete. The train that carried them back to London departed Ashford Station as the afternoon was settling into the gentle melancholy of winter twilight, the sky turning that particular shade of grey-blue that spoke of evening approaching, and the promise of darkness soon to follow. Holmes and Watson sat in their compartment, the same one they'd occupied 2 days prior, though it felt now like weeks had passed. So thoroughly had Greyfriars impressed itself upon their consciousness. The countryside rolled past the windows in shades of brown and white, the frost beginning to glitter more brightly as temperature dropped with the failing light. Smoke rose from scattered farmhouses, straight columns against the still air, and here and there figures moved across fields, farmers completing final tasks before night fell, their forms small and distant against the vast, sleeping earth. Watson watched Holmes, who sat with his eyes closed, his head tilted back against the seat, his hands folded across his chest. Not sleeping, Watson knew, but thinking, arranging the case's final details into order, filing away observations and conclusions, letting the tension of revelation slowly dissolve into the quieter satisfaction of work completed. Edmund Tovey, Watson said finally, his voice soft in the compartment's warmth, will hang for what he did. Holmes opened his eyes, but didn't move otherwise. Yes, though I suspect Lady Carmichael will argue for mercy, transportation rather than execution, citing Tovey's years of service, his genuine affection for the estate, the fact that his crime was born of desperation rather than malice. The courts may listen, or they may not. The law is less interested in motivation than in outcome, and the outcome was a man dead of cold and calculation. He truly believed he was saving Greyfriars. And perhaps he was, in his own twisted logic. The insurance money will indeed settle the debts, and Lady Carmichael has already indicated she'll sell the estate intact to a buyer who wishes to maintain it as a working property. The staff will keep their positions, the tenants their leases. Greyfriars will continue. Holmes's expression was unreadable. But Lord Carmichael will not. That is the exchange Tovey made, a man's life for an estate's continuity, whether such mathematics are ever justifiable. He trailed off, leaving the question unfinished, hanging in the air between them. Watson thought of Tovey's face in the kitchen, tears streaming but voice steady, confessing not with the hope of absolution, but with the simple exhausted relief of someone who'd carried a terrible secret and was grateful finally to set it down. The magistrate had come within the hour, and Tovey had repeated his confession formally, had allowed himself to be taken into custody without resistance, had paused only once, at the threshold of Greyfriars, looking back at the house he'd served for 20 years. before climbing into the wagon that would carry him to Ashford's small jail to await trial. The forged will, Watson said. He must have worked on it for months. The paper aged artificially, the signatures practiced until they were perfect. All that effort, that careful planning, just to create a justification for murder he'd already decided to commit. The human mind excels at creating frameworks to justify what the heart has already chosen, Holmes observed. Tovey didn't forge a will, and then decide murder was necessary to make it credible. He decided the estate must be saved, that Lord Carmichael was the obstacle to salvation, and then constructed the elaborate apparatus of forgery and locked rooms to transform murder into mystery, crime into puzzle. He believed that if the death appeared impossible, investigation would focus on the impossibility, rather than the simple question of motive and opportunity. But you saw through it immediately. Not immediately, but the ice house itself told the story once I understood what questions to ask. The bolt that wouldn't open suggested temperature-related issues. The smell of spirits on Lord Carmichael's body, enough to impair, not enough to incapacitate, suggested someone had ensured he would be vulnerable. The routine of his inspections, known to everyone on the estate, provided the framework. And the forged will, hidden where it would be discovered during spring maintenance, revealed the ultimate purpose. Tovey's mistake was thinking that complexity equaled cleverness, that an impossible crime would be an unsolvable crime. The train swayed gently as it rounded a curve, and Watson felt the familiar rhythm of rail travel settling into his bones, the steady percussion of wheels on track, the slight vibration through the seat, the sense of distance being consumed steadily, inevitably, carrying them away from Grey Friars and back toward the familiar streets of London. Lady Carmichael, Watson said after a moment. She bore it with remarkable composure. She is a woman who has survived one impossibility and discovered it was merely tragedy dressed in mystery's costume. I suspect she will survive. What comes next as well? The trial, the testimony, the revelation of her husband's debts and Tovey's delusions. She has that particular strength. Holmes shifted in his seat, opening his eyes fully now and looking out at the darkening countryside. Though I wonder what she will do with Grey Friars once it's sold, whether she'll remain in Kent or move elsewhere, start again in a place not haunted by ice houses and locked doors and winters that killed. Would you, in her position? Holmes considered this. I don't know. I've never understood the attachment people form to places, to land, to houses that hold more memory than joy. But then, I've never owned anything that required such attachment. Baker Street is lodgings, Watson. Comfortable, familiar, but ultimately temporary. I could leave it tomorrow and feel only mild nostalgia, whereas Lady Carmichael has lost not just her husband, but the estate that defined her family for 300 years. That is a different order of loss, entirely. The compartment fell silent again, the two men alone with their thoughts as the train carried them through the gathering darkness. Watson found himself thinking of the ice house, that cold stone structure half buried in the hillside, and wondering if it would continue to be used for its intended purpose, or if Grey Friars' new owner would seal it shut, let it return to earth, erase the place where murder had masqueraded as mystery. By the time they reached Charing Cross, full night had fallen, and London received them back with its usual indifference. gas lamps glowing in the fog, hansoms clattering past, the great city absorbed in its own endless business of living and dying, loving and losing, continuing despite and because of everything that occurred within its boundaries. They took a cab to Baker Street, and when they climbed the familiar 17 steps to their rooms, Mrs. Hudson met them at the door with relief plain on her face. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank goodness you're back safe. I've kept the fire going, and there's stew on the stove if you're hungry." "You are," Holmes said warmly, "a treasure beyond price, Mrs. Hudson." The sitting room wrapped around them like welcome itself, the fire burning steady in the grate, the gaslight soft on familiar furniture, the scent of home, tobacco and old books, and the particular mustiness of rooms lived in and loved. Watson sank into his chair with a sigh of contentment, feeling the journey's tension finally release from his shoulders, and watched as Holmes moved to stand by the window, looking out at Baker Street's evening bustle. "Another case concluded," Watson said quietly. "Another mystery resolved." "Yes." Holmes's reflection in the dark glass showed a faint smile. "Though I confess I prefer mysteries that don't require such cold truths. Ice houses and frozen locks, men dying slowly while winter holds them fast." He turned from the window. "Give me a good art theft or a missing document. Next time, Watson. Something that doesn't require explaining how metal contracts when the temperature drops, or how desperation can freeze a man's heart more thoroughly than any winter night." "I'll see what I can arrange," Watson said with a smile, and reached for his notebook, thinking already of how he would write this case. The adventure of the ice house, perhaps, or the problem of the frozen lock, knowing that the telling would soften some of the sadness, would transform tragedy into story, would let readers experience the puzzle without the weight of having stood in that cold stone space and understood what Tovey had done and why, and at what cost. Holmes moved to his violin, taking it up with the gentle attention one gives to old friends, and drew the bow across the strings in a long, low note that filled the room like warmth itself. He played no recognizable melody, just slow improvisations that wound around the fire's crackle and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps in the hallway below, and the distant sounds of London going about its evening business. Watson closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, let Baker Street's familiar comfort ease away the memory of frost and locked doors and a man's last cold hours. Outside, rain began to fall, not the decisive downpour of storms, but the gentle, persistent rain of English winters, the kind that would continue through the night and into morning, washing the city clean, filling gutters and drains, running eventually to the Thames, and from there to the sea. And somewhere in Kent, at Greyfriars Estate, that same rain was falling on empty grounds and a locked ice house, on an estate that would soon belong to someone else, on land that would continue regardless of who claimed ownership, or who lay in the churchyard beyond the old friary ruins. The world continued, as it always did, indifferent to mystery and resolution alike, caring only that spring would follow winter, that ice would eventually melt, that cold, given time and patience, would always yield to warmth. Holmes's violin sang on, and Watson let himself drift toward sleep in his chair, comfortable and safe and home, while the rain fell softly on London and the fire burned low, and the case of the Icehouse murder became memory, became story, became one more chapter in the long chronicle of mysteries solved and truths revealed, and the peculiar friendship between a detective and a doctor who chased impossibilities together and always found their way back home.